what is stress? How to define stress in the first place?
Yeah, so stress is an experience in the body, um, and it can have various degrees of salience and various degrees of valence, right? So it can be chronic, it can be distress, which is generally what we experience in modern life. Um, so, as a product of our lifestyle, of culture, we can be kind of overworked under a tremendous amount of pressure, um, kind of subject to a lot of hyperbole and sensationalism and fear. Um, and that can push us into this experience in the body that is chronic distress or bad stress. And we know it when we feel it, but there are also objective metrics to it. So, you can measure it, you know, most simply kind of with cortisol, but testing, but in a whole variety of ways, because the downstream impacts of this distress or chronic bad stress um, are kind of multifarious. So anything from kind of gut dysbiosis to elevated glucose levels to kind of depressed immune system. So that's bad stress, if you will. But stress, can also be experienced in short, acute bursts. And evolutionarily, that is more or less how we did experience it.
Hmm.
Um, and so these acute bursts of stress, whether they're physiological or psychological, um, the body is actually naturally engineered to bounce back, if you will, from that experience. And we know that just by sprinting up a hill, our respiratory and our heart rate will zip up and spike. And then the body brings us back to homeostasis, equilibrium, balance, alignment, if you will. Um, and that is good stress because it turns out that the body experiences what is known as hormesis, so a beneficial impact physiologically and psychologically to stress when it's experienced in acute and short bursts. You can sort of now, unfortunately, in the modern age, most of the stress that we experience in our body is chronic and bad, and that sets up a whole panoply of evolutionary mismatches, which we can unpack. But in this kind of era of endless convenience and comfort and convenience and ease, we have to now sort of self-impose acute stress in order to align with our inherent biology and reap some of those benefits. And this is what I'm trying to kind of unpack, both psychologically, physiologically. Also, how does good stress, apply to social situations, for example?
Hmm.
Because we experience a lot of social stress now too. But we experience it very, very differently than from our Paleolithic ancestors. So that's kind of how I think of this dichotomy between bad and good
What, is,
stress.
what does that mean, social stress?
So, like, for example, right now in culture, so much of our communication has now become sort of digital, right? So
Hmm.
there's all of this kind of anonymous digital warriorship sort of being waged anonymously behind screens. And it's not like conflict never existed before. Conflict is as old as the universe. In fact, conflict again can be positive and yield positive results. But evolutionarily, how did we used to deal with conflict? And I might just say that this might be a fun guide. We can use him or not, but I created this sort of avatar of myself, who I call Fedge, which is just sort of unimaginably my name spelled backwards. But he's kind of my East African, great times 600 grandfather who, lived on the Serengeti. And I oftentimes try to like put myself in his shoes, although he didn't generally wear any, but, and that's another point of conversation. But I was like, how did Fedge deal with conflict? Well, he largely dealt with it face to face, right? And in that way, we were so obviously reliant on each other. Community is so adaptive that we actually had to work through our forms of conflict resolution face to face, such that we found common ground, cooperation, common humanity. We knew that we were invested in collective enterprise, et cetera. And we were just much better at it. I think when we had that opportunity to consistently be face to face. And now I think, we have to actually lean in to stressful conversations, actually engineer them into our life instead of just kind of straw manning ad hominem, barbs of vitriol,
Yeah.
sent over the internet.
Yeah. Yeah. Stressful conversations. It seems like a part of that is a lot of the conversations that I experience is just like two monologues, and the person's already, it's just two people trying to prove their point and be confirmed to be correct, and not really even having much empathy or compassion for the person on the other side. So I wonder, how does a person start to bridge greater relation or integration with a person, that it's not just two monologues, but actually can turn into connection and conversation?
Yeah. Well, I think there's sort of an on-ramp there. I mean, first of all, you need yourself to be in a parasympathetic place. So you
Mm-hmm.
need to feel safe and secure. And that honestly requires some degree of training, in this day and age. So, we might be the recipient of some like insult, on social media or in an email or et cetera. And our first, reaction to that may be one of bad stress, of essentially dysregulation.
Yeah. Like reaction.
Um, Reaction, totally. And that can put us into a place of kind of amygdala hijack, such that then we're angry. Someone has essentially transferred their own anger to you. You've
Yep.
picked it up in the form of like an ember, and then you are just brooding over your rejoinder, waiting to throw that ember back. Of course, all that time, right? You're the one getting burnt, right?
Yeah.
So the Stoics had this concept of euthymia. So euthymia is sort of like an unflappable state of like a emotional equilibrium.
Hmm.
And for them, like the best way to disarm an insult was just to be unaffected by it, right? So I would certainly not make a case to excuse like odious behavior and neglect and abuse, and et cetera. At the same time, one can take some of our own personal responsibility to building what I call the psychological immune system.
Hmm.
So, and I know your audience is very briefed on the kind of physiological immune system. So we know how we build that. So, right. So, low grade exposure to viruses and bacteria and pathogens over time,
Sun,
you know,
sun the anus
on the anus all day
as
if
much as
you would like
possible.
to. I would just say maybe at higher latitudes if you have less melanin, but that's another thing.
Use zinc
Yeah, use
just in
zinc.
case you're at lower latitudes.
Yeah, um, but we build our physiological immune system through some exposure to insult, right? So there's my wife grew up on like a hippie commune in Northern California. She ate a lot of dirt, basically. And if you go back her parents still live on this funky ranch up there, and if you go back, you understand why she has such a strong immune system.
Yeah.
It's like there's like a crusty paisley comforter that hasn't been changed in
Yeah, she's probably not
3 decades.
allergic to hardly anything.
No.
Yeah.
And so, the same logic can be applied to your psychological immune system, right? So exposure to some degree of low-grade pathogen, of low-grade insult, over time, you can really inure yourself to it. You can really build some immunity, to insult or to ad hominem. And I have basically put myself deliberately through that experience.